Hello, excellent people. This is your Daily Excellence Digest for April 19th, 2021. I want to pick up where I left off yesterday when I began framing the conversation around virtues. I want to talk very specifically today about this notion of active virtue, or a virtue being an action, or in that kind of frame of reference. I kind of disclosed last time that in all my work thinking about virtues and values over the past number of years, I really have not been able to come up with passive virtues. I am personally biased to see virtue as a thing that you do, or a way that you live when you're living out your values, right? That's kind of how I defined it the other night. Was I said, a virtue is an action, is a way that you behave virtuously when you are living in accordance with your values, and thus your values determine your virtue, and your different people with different values are going to see different actions as virtuous. And so I was thinking about this afterwards, because I was like, surely I can do better than just say, well, virtue is active and passive is not virtuous, because I don't know that passivity should be seen as a bad thing. I know that we live in a culture that values accomplishment and values success and values achievement and all these things that are very active things, the things that you go out there and do. And I personally value it not only because of cultural pressure, although certainly the culture has shaped my opinions, but also because, there are a lot of things that I'm a very active person, I have a very active mind. I'm not able to just sit around and not think. So I've always thought a lot about a lot of things, and it's just my nature, my temperament, if you will. So I was thinking about this, and I was reminded of the book Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb. And in the beginning of his book, he talks about this notion of fragile. Like he poses the question, what is the opposite of fragile? And he says that when he was originally conceptualizing his framework, he asked this question to a lot of people, and that many people came back with the answer that robust was the opposite of fragile. But he was saying that robust is neutral on the continuum. So you have fragile here, you have robust in the middle, and then you have anti-fragile over here. And that's where he was arguing that prior to his coinage of the term anti-fragile, there wasn't a term for anti-fragile. And he said that it exists in the cultural psyche, but it didn't exist in a fully articulated way. I'm not making a case or arguing for and against, but I like this continuum notion when we're talking about virtue, because, like I said, I've been thinking of virtue as active versus passive, as though passive is the opposite of active. But I wonder if passive is not, in fact, the opposite of active. At least, can we reframe it where active and passive are not opposites, but that passive is the center point on the continuum, wherein active is here, passive is here, and then something else is over here. So anti-active, right? And then I began to develop this. I was like, well, what am I really talking about when I say active virtue? And what comes to mind is they are being virtues, kind of like being verbs, right? A being verb is to be, and all that sort of stuff. And I was thinking about, what if you have a being virtue, as in a virtue that guides your way of being? And then you have being virtue, you have passive, or we'll call it this sort of poised position where you're just sort of like patiently observing. I find that patient observation is like the lowest activity state that my mind comfortably can sit in. Those of you who are into meditation may be able to speak more articulately than me as to states that are even lower energy than that. But for me, there's this sort of like, so if you're familiar with the OODA loop, which is the observe, orient, decide, act, I will absolutely refer to this again and again, and I'll talk about it specifically at some point. But observe is the first point, orient is the second. And I find that there's this observe, orient thing that you can do where you sit, do nothing, observe and orient, observe and orient, observe and orient, orienting yourself to your observations. But there's some action inherent in that versus observing in this sort of like mirroring pond kind of way, right? There's an Alan Watts speech where he talks about birds flying over a still lake and that the reflection is cast but does not hold the birds at all. And that's kind of what that base level observation with no orientation is, because the lake is not changed by the birds flying over top and their reflection. And so this is all getting a little bit abstract. And so to bring it a little bit down, that was that center point. That's that passive. If you redefine passive as not opposite of active, once again, switching active a little bit to being. So you have a being virtue, then you have a passive, patient observation here, and then you have non-being. And so this gets interesting when you say being virtue versus non-being virtue. This could potentially be reframed as constructive virtue versus destructive virtue, where if we think about a thing that helps to foster the being that we want, right? The being that is good, the being that is desirable, the life that is good, versus the thing that is antagonistic to that. And so then we end up having, something almost like a 10 Commandments, right? The thou shalt not. So you have this admonitions against. And so that's an interesting new frame of reference. I have not yet sat down and thought about, what could those virtues be? What could these anti-virtues be? These things that are the non-being virtues. And, certainly the easiest solution is going to be to build the counterpoints to my own virtues. And so I mentioned already that courage is one of the things that I consider to be virtuous. And thus, in this instance, you might have cowardice as an anti-virtue or as a non-being virtue. I think that's a little bit of an easy way out as far as the logic goes. I think there's probably some more work that could be done there. And there's probably some really worthwhile stuff to discover when you dig into that, if you do it with due diligence instead of just saying, well, we'll just cast everything as opposites of the desirable qualities. Because while that is useful, it's probably insufficient. It probably doesn't do justice to the new framework. So, like I said, I mostly wanted to kind of create the conversation around this. And I think we'll come back to this again soon, probably not right away, but I'll do some homework on it myself, see if I can come up with some stuff, and then I'll share the results. So if you have any thoughts on this, I'm definitely interested, like I said, because this is a new project and a new way of thinking about it. If other folks already have walked this path and can point to either resources or their own experiences, I'm wide open. I'd really like to hear about it. So again, I appreciate you being along with me on this journey towards excellence. Keep aiming daily.